Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, only to dismiss it as paranoia? What if I told you that feeling might have saved your life? Welcome back to MrNightveil, where tonight's 10 real stalker stories will shatter any sense of safety you have left. These aren't Hollywood fiction. They're genuine accounts from survivors whose worst nightmares became reality when obsessed strangers turned their lives into living hell. From digital predators to neighbors with deadly intentions, prepare to question every shadow and every notification. Hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to face the truth about modern stalking. My name is Ethan, and I'm 23 years old. I work as a barista at a local coffee shop in Portland while finishing my degree in computer science. What I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago, and I still can't drink coffee without looking over my shoulder. It started so innocently that I almost feel stupid for not seeing the warning signs earlier. But looking back, I realize that's exactly how these things begin, with small gestures that seem harmless until they're not. There was this regular customer who came in every Tuesday and Thursday, around 2 in the afternoon. He was probably in his 40s, always wore a navy blue jacket, and ordered the same thing: medium dark roast, no cream, no sugar. At first, he seemed like any other customer. Polite, quiet, would nod and say thank you when I handed him his coffee. The only thing that stood out was how he always asked specifically for me to make his drink, even if other baristas were available. I thought maybe he just preferred consistency in his coffee preparation, which isn't uncommon in this business. The first red flag I should have noticed was the tips. Most customers leave $1, maybe $2 if they're feeling generous. But this guy started leaving $5 tips, then 10s, then 20s. When he left a $50 tip on a $3 coffee, I knew something was off. Along with the excessive money came little notes written on napkins or receipt paper. They started innocent enough. "Thanks for the great coffee," or "You make the best drinks here." But gradually, they became more personal. He started commenting on my shirt choices, mentioning how nice my smile was, or how he looked forward to seeing me all week. I tried to brush it off as a lonely guy who was just being overly friendly. But then he started knowing things about my schedule that he shouldn't have known. He began showing up on days I worked that weren't Tuesday or Thursday. When I mentioned to my manager that I was concerned, she said as long as he wasn't being directly threatening, there wasn't much we could do except keep an eye on the situation. I wish I had trusted my instincts more and pushed harder for action at that point. The situation escalated when he started showing up at my college. I first noticed him sitting in the student center where I usually studied between classes. When I saw him there 3 days in a row, I realized it couldn't be a coincidence. Portland is a big city, and the chances of randomly running into the same person multiple times in different locations are slim to none. He never approached me on campus, just sat at nearby tables, reading a book or scrolling through his phone. But I could feel him watching me. The feeling of being observed constantly started affecting my ability to concentrate on my studies. Then I started seeing him in my neighborhood. I lived in a small apartment building about 15 minutes from campus, and I began noticing his car, a dark green Honda Accord, parked on my street at different times of the day. Sometimes it was there when I left for work in the morning, sometimes when I came home from evening classes. I started taking different routes home and varying my schedule, but he always seemed to know where I was going to be. The gifts started appearing outside my apartment door about a month after I first noticed him following me. Small things at first. A coffee mug with the coffee shop's logo, a pack of my favorite energy drinks, a notebook for school. Each gift came with increasingly detailed notes about my daily activities. He knew what time I left for work, what classes I was taking, where I usually grabbed lunch between lectures. The notes mentioned things like how I always wore my blue jacket on cold days, or how I had looked tired during my Thursday shift the week before. Reading those notes felt like having someone narrate my life back to me, and it made me realize how closely he had been watching every aspect of my routine. I finally went to the police after finding a particularly disturbing note that described in detail what I had worn to bed 2 nights prior, including the color of my pajamas and the book I had been reading before going to sleep. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but explained that unless there was a direct threat or evidence of breaking and entering, they couldn't do much more than file a report and increase patrols in my area. They suggested I document everything, take photos of the gifts, keep all the notes, write down times and dates when I saw him following me. The most terrifying moment came on a Sunday evening when I returned from a weekend trip to visit my parents. I had been gone for 3 days and was exhausted from the drive back. I walked into my apartment, dropped my bags, and went straight to my bedroom to change into comfortable clothes. That's when I noticed things were different. My bed was made, but I distinctly remembered leaving it unmade when I left. My desk chair was pushed in, which I never do. Small items had been moved. My laptop was closed, but I always left it open. Books on my nightstand were stacked differently than I remembered. My blood ran cold when I found the photos. They were tucked under my pillow, printed photographs of me sleeping, taken from inside my bedroom. The timestamps showed. They had been taken over several weeks, including the night before I left for my parents' house. In some photos, I was facing the camera directly, completely unaware that someone was in my room watching me sleep. In others, you could see him standing next to my bed, his face partially visible in the dim light from my alarm clock. Along with the photos was the longest note he had ever left, describing how peaceful I looked while sleeping, how he enjoyed watching me dream, and how he felt like we had developed such an intimate connection through these nighttime visits. He wrote about touching my hair while I slept, and how he had been taking small items as keepsakes. Things I had noticed were missing, but assumed I had simply misplaced. I called the police immediately and refused to stay in the apartment. The responding officers found evidence that someone had been entering through my bathroom window, which faced an alley behind the building. The window lock was broken, but in a way that wasn't immediately obvious unless you knew what to look for. They discovered he had been using a ladder to climb up to the 2nd floor and had probably been doing this for weeks. The investigation revealed that he had been arrested twice before for similar behavior with other women, but had never been convicted due to lack of sufficient evidence. This time, the photographs provided the proof needed to charge him with breaking and entering, stalking, and invasion of the privacy. 2 days after I filed the report, they found him hiding in the laundry room of my apartment building at 3 in the morning, waiting with more gifts and another camera. During the trial, I learned that he had been researching my life extensively. He knew where my parents lived, had copies of my class schedule from hacking into my student email account, and had been following my social media activity through fake accounts he had created. He had detailed notes about my friends, my part-time work schedule, and even my favorite coffee shops and restaurants around the city. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and a 5-year restraining order. But the psychological impact lasted much longer than his jail time. I moved to a different apartment across town, changed my work schedule, and even switched to online classes for the remainder of the semester. I installed multiple locks on my doors and windows, bought security cameras, and started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. For months, I would wake up multiple times during the night, convinced I heard someone in my apartment. The experience taught me that stalking isn't just about someone following you around. It's about the complete invasion of your privacy and sense of safety. It's about having your entire life monitored and documented by someone who feels entitled to your time, your space, and your attention. It's about living with the constant fear that someone is watching, waiting, and planning their next move while you're just trying to live your normal life. Even now, 18 months later, I still find myself checking over my shoulder when I'm out in public. I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and I encourage everyone else to do the same. If someone's behavior makes you uncomfortable, don't dismiss it as paranoia. Document everything, tell people you trust, and don't hesitate to involve law enforcement if you feel threatened. Your safety and peace of mind are worth more than worrying about seeming rude or overreactive to someone whose intentions might be harmful. My name is Celeste, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing agency in Austin, Texas. What I'm about to share with you happened over the course of 8 months and completely changed how I view social media and online privacy. It started with what seemed like an innocent friend request on Facebook, but it quickly spiraled into a digital nightmare that invaded every aspect of my life and forced me to essentially disappear from the internet entirely. It was a typical Wednesday evening in March when I received a friend request from someone named Edward. His profile looked legitimate enough. Professional headshot as his profile picture, mutual friends from college, posts about graphic design and marketing that suggested we might have professional interests in common. I usually don't accept requests from people I don't know personally, but we had several mutual connections, and his profile seemed authentic. I accepted the request without thinking much about it, assuming he was probably someone from the design community in Austin that I had met at a networking event or conference. Within hours of accepting his friend request, Edward started commenting on everything I posted. Not just new content, but he went back through months of my previous posts and started liking and commenting on photos, status updates, and shared articles. His comments were always positive, but strangely detailed and personal. He would comment on photos of my weekend hiking trips, mentioning specific trails and locations that I hadn't tagged in the posts. When I shared photos from my favorite coffee shop, he would comment about how he loved that particular corner table where I always sat, even though I had never mentioned which table it was in the post. I started feeling uncomfortable when I realized he was commenting on my posts within minutes of me publishing them, no matter what time of day or night I posted. It was like he had notifications turned on for everything I did online, and he was constantly monitoring my activity. When I posted a photo of a book I was reading at 11 at night, he commented within 5 minutes about how it was one of his favorite novels and asked detailed questions about which chapter I was on. When I shared a photo of my breakfast the next morning at 6:30, he immediately commented about how healthy my eating habits were and asked if I always had coffee with my eggs. The situation became more disturbing when Edward started creating additional social media accounts to interact with me. After I limited who could see my posts and comment on them, new profiles started appearing with different names but the same behavioral patterns. Riley would like my Instagram posts, Brandon would comment on my Twitter updates, and Milan would send me messages on LinkedIn about my professional work. At first, I didn't realize these were all the same person. But the writing style was identical, and they all had the same obsessive knowledge about my daily activities and personal preferences. Things escalated when he started contacting my friends and family members through social media. My sister called me one evening, confused because someone named Edward had sent her a message asking detailed questions about my childhood, my dating history, and my current living situation. He had told her that we were close friends and that he was planning a surprise for me, which is why he needed personal information. My college roommate received similar messages, and several coworkers got friend requests from profiles that were clearly fake. but were asking about my work schedule and professional projects. The real terror began when Edward started using my personal information to create fake dating profiles. I discovered this when a friend showed me a Tinder profile that used my photos and personal details but listed interests and preferences that weren't mine. The profile claimed I was looking for serious relationships and included my real job title and the neighborhood where I lived. I was horrified to learn that multiple men had been messaging this fake profile, believing they were talking to me. And some had even shown up at coffee shops and restaurants, mentioned in conversations they thought they were having with me. Edward had somehow gained access to my email accounts and was reading my private messages. I realized this when he started referencing details from emails I had sent to friends and family members. Details that I had never shared publicly on social media. He knew about a job interview I had scheduled, a medical appointment I was worried about, and a disagreement I had had with my landlord about apartment maintenance. He would weave these private details into his social media comments in ways that seemed innocent to outside observers, but made it clear to me that he was reading my personal correspondence. The harassment extended to my professional life when Edward started creating fake reviews for my design work on various freelance platforms. Some reviews were glowingly positive, but contained personal details about me that clients shouldn't know, making it obvious they were fake. Others were negative reviews that criticized not just my work, but made personal attacks about my appearance and character. He created multiple fake business email addresses and started contacting my employer, sometimes pretending to be potential clients interested in hiring me for projects. Other times sending complaints about my supposed unprofessional behavior. The most frightening escalation happened when Edward posted my home address on various online forums and classified ad websites. He created posts claiming I was giving away furniture, electronics, and other household items for free, which resulted in strangers showing up at my apartment door at all hours of the day and night. Some people were angry when I explained I wasn't giving anything away, assuming I was lying to keep the items for myself. Others were understanding, but it was still terrifying to have strangers who knew my address coming to my door because of false information posted online. He also posted my personal information on dating websites with explicit descriptions of sexual preferences and activities that weren't true, along with my real phone number and email address. This resulted in dozens of inappropriate messages and phone calls from men who believed I had posted these profiles myself. No matter how many times I reported these fake profiles to the website administrators, new ones would appear faster than I could get them removed. The psychological impact was devastating. I stopped posting anything on social media because I knew he was watching and documenting everything. I changed my phone number twice, but he always seemed to find the new number within days. I had to explain to friends and family members not to share any information about me online because he was constantly monitoring their accounts for details about my life. I felt like I was living in a fishbowl, where every aspect of my existence was being observed, documented, and manipulated by someone I had never actually met in person. The situation reached a breaking point when Edward started impersonating me online to damage my professional reputation. He created fake social media profiles using my name and photos, then used these accounts to post controversial political opinions, make inappropriate comments on other people's posts, and engage in online arguments that made me look unprofessional. Several potential clients mentioned seeing these posts when they decided not to hire me for design projects, and I realized he was actively trying to destroy my career and livelihood. I finally went to the police after he posted my address on a forum dedicated to harassment and doxing, along with false claims about my personal life that put me in physical danger. The post included my work schedule, the route I usually took to walk my dog, and detailed descriptions of my daily routines. Several people from the forum started showing up in my neighborhood, and I knew the situation had escalated beyond online harassment to potential physical threats. The investigation revealed that Edward wasn't even his real name. The person stalking me was actually someone named Richard, who lived in Dallas and had a history of online harassment targeting women in creative professions. He had been using sophisticated techniques to hack into my accounts, including social engineering attacks, where he convinced customer service representatives to reset my passwords by pretending to be me. He had created an elaborate fake identity with professional photos stolen from a marketing executive in California. And he had been using this persona to infiltrate online communities where I was active. The police were able to track his real identity through IP addresses and digital forensics. But by then, he had caused irreparable damage to my online presence and professional reputation. Even after his arrest, fake profiles and posts continued to appear because he had shared my information with other online harassers who continued his work for their own entertainment. I had to hire a reputation management company to help remove false information about me from search results, and the process took over a year and cost thousands of dollars. I ultimately had to delete all my social media accounts, change my name professionally, and move to a different city to escape the ongoing harassment from people who had been given my information through the networks Richard had created. I now work under a pseudonym and maintain minimal online presence, using privacy settings and security measures that I never thought I would need. The experience taught me that online stalking can be just as invasive and damaging as physical stalking, and the effects can persist long after the original perpetrator is caught and prosecuted. My name is Malachi, and I'm 35 years old. I work as an insurance adjuster in suburban Minneapolis, Minnesota. What I'm going to tell you happened over the course of 6 months and completely shattered my sense of security in my own home. It started with what seemed like an incredibly helpful and friendly new neighbor, but it quickly turned into a nightmare that made me realize how vulnerable we all are to someone who lives just a few feet away from our most private moments. When Thomas moved into the house next door last September, he seemed like the ideal neighbor. He was probably in his late 40s, well-groomed, and always eager to lend a hand with yard work or home maintenance projects. The first time we met, I was struggling to carry groceries from my car while juggling my keys, and he immediately offered to help. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and mentioned that he worked in IT consulting from home, which explained why I often saw his car in the driveway during business hours. At first, Thomas's helpfulness was genuinely appreciated. When my lawnmower broke down in early October, he offered to mow my lawn until I could get it repaired. When I mentioned that my gutters needed cleaning before winter, he volunteered to help with that too. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to appear whenever I was working on outdoor projects, always with the right tools or expertise to assist. I thought I had lucked out with such a considerate neighbor, especially after living next to a family with loud teenagers for the previous 3 years. The first thing that struck me as odd was how Thomas always seemed to know my schedule better than I did. If I mentioned casually on a Saturday that I was planning to paint my fence the following weekend, he would show up on that exact day with paintbrushes and drop cloths, even though I hadn't confirmed the timing with him. When I told him I was expecting a delivery on Tuesday, he would knock on my door Tuesday morning asking if I needed help carrying anything inside, even before the delivery truck had arrived. At first, I attributed this to him being observant and considerate, but gradually I realized he was paying an unusual amount of attention to my daily routines. I started noticing that Thomas had installed several security cameras around his property, which wasn't unusual in itself, but their positioning seemed strange. Instead of pointing toward the street or his own driveway, several of the cameras were angled in ways that captured clear views of my front door, my driveway, and my backyard. When I asked him about the extensive camera system, he explained that there had been some break-ins in the neighborhood, and he wanted to keep an eye on both of our properties for security purposes. He assured me the cameras were only recording his own property, but the angles suggested otherwise. The situation became more uncomfortable when I realized Thomas was going through my garbage and mail. First noticed this when he made casual comments about things he shouldn't have known. After I had thrown away some old prescription bottles, he asked how my back injury was healing, even though I'd never mentioned having back problems. When I received a notice from my insurance company about a policy renewal, he mentioned that he had experience with that particular insurance company and offered to help me review my coverage, even though I had never told him which company I used. Thomas also started copying my behavior and purchases in ways that felt invasive rather than coincidental. If I bought a new outdoor plant for my garden, he would show up with the exact same variety the next day. When I installed solar lights along my walkway, he installed identical lights in the same configuration. If I ordered takeout from a particular restaurant, he would mention that he had tried the same restaurant and ask detailed questions about what I had ordered. The coincidences became so frequent that I started to suspect he was monitoring my deliveries and online shopping. The most disturbing realization came when I discovered that Thomas had been entering my house while I was away. I first suspected this when I returned from a 3-day business trip and found that my thermostat had been adjusted to a temperature I never used. Small items around the house were in slightly different positions than I remembered leaving them. My coffee maker was unplugged, which I never did. And there was a coffee mug in my dishwasher that I didn't remember using. At first, I questioned my own memory, thinking perhaps I had simply forgotten these details before leaving town. The evidence became undeniable when I found a hidden camera in my bedroom. I had been having trouble sleeping and decided to rearrange my furniture to create a more relaxing environment. When I moved my dresser, I discovered a small wireless camera that had been carefully concealed behind it, positioned to record my bed. The camera was sophisticated and expensive, clearly not something that had been placed there accidentally or as part of some previous home security system. The timestamp on the device showed it had been recording for several weeks. I immediately checked the rest of my house and found 2 more cameras. One in my living room, hidden inside what looked like a decorative air freshener, and another in my kitchen concealed within a smoke detector that looked identical to my existing smoke detectors, but was actually a recording device. The cameras were wireless and appeared to be transmitting data remotely, which meant Thomas had been watching live feeds of my daily activities inside my own home. Going through my house more carefully, I found other evidence of Thomas's presence. My computer showed signs of being accessed, with browser history entries I didn't remember making and files that had been opened recently. My bedroom closet had been searched through with clothing items folded, differently than my usual method. Most disturbing was finding several of my personal items missing. A college t-shirt I frequently wore around the house, a coffee mug with sentimental value, and a small framed photo of my family that usually sat on my nightstand. The discovery that sent me into complete panic was finding Thomas's detailed journal documenting my daily routines. I discovered this journal in my basement, hidden behind my water heater, which meant he had been coming into my house regularly enough to feel comfortable storing personal items there. The journal contained months of entries describing my sleep schedule, work routine, eating habits, phone calls, and even intimate details about my personal hygiene and private moments. He had documented what time I typically showered, what I wore to bed, what I watched on television, and when I usually fell asleep. The journal also contained detailed floor plans of my house, notes about which windows and doors were easiest to access, and observations about my security habits. He had written about my tendency to leave the back door unlocked when I was working in the yard. The fact that I rarely closed my bedroom curtains completely, and which nights of the week I typically stayed up late or went to bed early. Reading these entries felt like having my entire private life exposed and analyzed by someone who had been studying me like a specimen. Most terrifying were the entries that revealed Thomas's growing obsession and future plans. He wrote about feeling a deep connection to me and believing that we were meant to be together. He described fantasies about us living as roommates or partners, sharing meals and daily routines. The more recent entries showed escalating possessiveness and anger when I interacted with other people, particularly when I had friends over for dinner or when delivery drivers spent more than a few minutes at my door. I found evidence that Thomas had been sabotaging my social relationships and professional opportunities. He had been intercepting my mail, including invitations to social events and communications from potential clients for freelance work I did on weekends. He had also been making phone calls pretending to be me, canceling appointments and declining invitations, which explained why several friends had seemed distant recently and why some professional opportunities had mysteriously disappeared. The final straw was discovering that Thomas had made copies of my house keys and had been coming and going as he pleased. I found his spare key hidden under a loose floorboard in my basement, along with detailed notes about my daily schedule and plans for gradually inserting himself more openly into my life. His journal entries from the most recent weeks showed that he was planning to reveal his presence in my house and convince me that we should live together permanently. I immediately called the police and stayed at a hotel while they investigated. The search of Thomas's house revealed extensive surveillance equipment, hundreds of photos and videos of me taken without my knowledge, and detailed files documenting not just my routines, but also my financial information, work schedule, and personal relationships. They found stolen mail, personal items taken from my house, and evidence that he had been hacking into my online accounts and monitoring my digital communications. Thomas was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, stalking, invasion of privacy, identity theft, and multiple other crimes. During the investigation, I learned that I wasn't his first victim. Police found evidence that he had stalked at least 3 other people in previous neighborhoods using similar methods of surveillance and home invasion. He had moved frequently, always choosing houses next to single people who lived alone, and had perfected his techniques over several years. Even after his arrest and conviction, the psychological impact of knowing that someone had been living parallel to my life for months continues to affect me daily. I moved to a different city and now live in an apartment building with multiple security features, but I still find myself checking and rechecking locks, looking for hidden cameras, and feeling paranoid about neighbors who seem too friendly or helpful. The experience taught me that privacy and security in our own homes can be violated in ways we never imagine, and that the people who seem most helpful and trustworthy can sometimes be the most dangerous. My name is Jasmine, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a veterinary technician at a small animal clinic in Denver, Colorado. What I'm about to share with you is the most terrifying chapter of my life, spanning 8 months of psychological torture that began when I tried to end what I thought was a normal relationship. It taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most can become your worst nightmare, and that breaking up with someone doesn't always mean they'll accept that the relationship is over. I met Derek at a coffee shop near the veterinary clinic where I work. He was charming, well-dressed, and seemed genuinely interested in my career working with animals. We dated for about 4 months, and initially, everything seemed perfect. He was attentive, romantic, and supportive of my work. He would surprise me with flowers at the clinic and take me to nice restaurants on weekends. My friends and family liked him, and I thought I had finally found someone stable and caring after a string of disappointing relationships. The problem started small. Derek became increasingly possessive about my time, wanting to know my schedule down to the minute and getting upset when I made plans with friends without consulting him first. He would show up at my workplace unannounced, claiming he was just in the neighborhood, even though he lived on the opposite side of town. When I tried to discuss giving each other more space, he would become emotional and apologetic, promising to change while simultaneously making me feel guilty for wanting independence. The breaking point came when Derek started showing up at my apartment at all hours, sometimes sleeping in his car outside my building when I didn't answer his calls. He began making decisions about our future without consulting me, talking about moving in together and getting married as if these were already settled plans rather than discussions we needed to have. When I realized that I felt trapped rather than loved, I knew I had to end the relationship. I broke up with Derek on a Tuesday evening in March, as gently as possible, but making it clear that my decision was final. I explained that I needed space and time to focus on my career, and that I wasn't ready for the level of commitment he wanted. He seemed to accept it initially, even saying he understood and wanted me to be happy. I thought it was over and felt relieved that he had taken it so well. I was completely unprepared for what happened next. The stalking began within days of our breakup. Derek started calling my phone dozens of times per day, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to angry, to seemingly casual updates about his day, as if we were still together. When I stopped answering his calls, he began texting constantly, sending everything from long emotional messages about how much he missed me to photos of places we had visited together. He would send me screenshots of social media posts I had made, commenting on them as if we were still in a relationship. The harassment escalated when Derek started showing up at my workplace daily. He would arrive during my lunch breaks, claiming he just wanted to talk for a few minutes to work things out. When I refused to speak with him and asked my coworkers to tell him I was unavailable, he would wait in the parking lot for hours, watching for me to leave. My supervisor eventually had to ask him to stop coming to the clinic because he was making other employees uncomfortable and disrupting our work with animals who needed medical attention. Derek then began following me to places I went after work. If I stopped at the grocery store, he would appear in the same aisles, pretending it was a coincidence while trying to strike up conversations about mundane topics. When I went to the gym, he would show up there too, even though he had never expressed interest in fitness during our relationship. If I met friends for dinner, he would either call the restaurant asking for me or show up claiming he had made reservations at the same place by coincidence. The situation became more disturbing when Derek started contacting my family and friends, telling them that I was going through a difficult time and that he was worried about my mental health. He called my mother, explaining that I had been acting unstable since our breakup and suggesting that I needed professional help. He contacted my sister, claiming that I had asked him to reach out because I was too embarrassed to admit I wanted to get back together. He even called my supervisor at the veterinary clinic, expressing concern that I seemed distracted at work and might not be capable of properly caring for the animals. Derek began spreading false information about our relationship and the reasons for our breakup. He told mutual friends that I had cheated on him, that I had mental health issues that made me unpredictable, and that I was using drugs. These lies started affecting my social relationships, as some people began treating me differently or asking intrusive questions about my personal life. He created fake social media accounts to monitor my online activity and would reference things I had posted in his texts and voicemails, making it clear that he was still tracking my daily activities. The psychological manipulation intensified when Derek started leaving gifts and notes at my apartment. He somehow gained access to my building and would leave flowers, letters, and small presents outside my door. The notes were increasingly desperate and disturbing, alternating between expressions of love and threats about what he might do if I didn't take him back. Some notes contained detailed descriptions of my daily routines, showing that he had been watching me closely. Others included references to conversations I had had with friends, proving that he was somehow monitoring my private communications. The most terrifying escalation occurred when Derek began sabotaging my professional and personal relationships. He called the veterinary clinic multiple times, sometimes pretending to be a concerned pet owner complaining about my care of their animals. Other times claiming to be from regulatory agencies investigating the clinic. These false complaints forced my supervisor to waste time dealing with fake investigations and put my job in jeopardy. He also contacted several men I had briefly dated, telling them lies about me and discouraging them from continuing any relationships with me. Derek started showing up at my apartment building at all hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, banging on my door and demanding that I talk to him. Neighbors complained about the noise, and I was constantly on edge, never knowing when he might appear. He would leave his car running outside my building for hours, making it clear that he was watching and waiting. The constant surveillance made me feel like a prisoner in my own home, afraid to leave for work or social activities because I knew he would be following me. The breaking point came when Derek broke into my apartment while I was at work. I returned home to find that he had been inside, rearranging furniture and leaving notes throughout the apartment describing how much he missed being there with me. He had gone through my personal belongings, taken some of my clothing, and left a journal detailing his plans for us to get back together. The journal contained disturbing fantasies about our future together, and threats about what he would do to anyone who tried to keep us apart. I immediately called the police and learned that Derek had been arrested twice before for similar behavior with previous girlfriends. But the charges had been dropped when the women moved away, rather than pursue lengthy legal battles. The investigation revealed that he had been using sophisticated techniques to monitor my communications, including hacking into my email accounts and installing tracking software on my phone. He had been documenting my daily activities in detail and had created fake identities to gather information about my personal and professional life. Even after Derek was arrested and charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and harassment, the damage to my life was extensive. I had to move to a different apartment across town, change my phone number, and request a transfer to a different veterinary clinic. The stress of constantly looking over my shoulder and wondering when he might appear affected my work performance and personal relationships for months. I started therapy to deal with the anxiety and paranoia that developed during the months of harassment. The legal process was lengthy and emotionally draining, requiring me to relive the trauma repeatedly while testifying about the extent of Derek's stalking behavior. Even after he was convicted and sentenced to jail time with a restraining order, I lived in fear that he would resume the harassment once he was released. This experience taught me that restraining orders are just pieces of paper that can't physically prevent someone who is determined to violate them, and that the psychological impact of stalking can persist long after the actual harassment ends. My name is Amanda, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a marketing manager for a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago, Illinois. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 7 months and taught me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who share your office space every day. It began with what seemed like harmless workplace friendliness, but it quickly escalated into a nightmare that invaded every aspect of my professional and personal life, showing me how vulnerable we can be to someone who has access to our daily routines and professional information. Kenneth worked in the IT department of our company, 2 floors below my marketing team's office. We had different schedules and rarely interacted directly. but he started appearing at company events where I was present. At first, this seemed perfectly normal. Most employees attended the monthly all-hands meetings, quarterly celebrations, and office holiday parties. I barely noticed him initially, just another face in a company of over 200 employees. He was probably in his late 30s, quiet and seemed to keep to himself most of the time. The first thing that caught my attention was how Kenneth started timing his breaks and lunch periods to coincide with mine. If I went to the break room to get coffee at 10 in the morning, he would show up within minutes, making casual conversation about work projects or asking about my weekend plans. When I ate lunch in the company cafeteria, he would appear with his meal and ask if he could join me, even though there were plenty of empty tables available. Initially, I thought he was just being friendly and trying to build workplace relationships across departments. Kenneth's behavior became more noticeable when he started showing up at client meetings and presentations that had nothing to do with IT support. My marketing team frequently hosted presentations for potential clients, and these meetings were typically attended only by relevant team members and the prospective clients themselves. However, Kenneth began appearing at these meetings, claiming he was there to provide technical support or check on the audiovisual equipment, even when everything was working perfectly and no technical assistance had been requested. I became uncomfortable when I realized Kenneth had been accessing my employee files and personal information through the company's IT systems. He started making casual comments about details he shouldn't have known. My home address, my previous job history, my salary level, and even my emergency contact information. When I mentioned that I was considering taking a vacation, he would know the specific dates I had requested time off, even though this information should have been confidential between me and HR. He would reference details from my performance reviews and mention projects I was working on that weren't public knowledge within the company. The situation escalated when Kenneth started following me to lunch meetings with clients and after-work networking events. Even when I met clients at restaurants across the city, he would somehow appear at the same establishments, claiming it was a coincidence or that he had meetings nearby. These coincidences happened so frequently that some clients began asking if he was part of my team, and I had to awkwardly explain that he worked in a different department and wasn't involved in their projects. Kenneth began using his IT access to monitor my digital communications within the company. I realized this when he would reference details from emails I had sent to colleagues, including private conversations about project deadlines, client concerns, and internal company matters. He would bring up topics from emails I had sent to my direct supervisor, sometimes within hours of me sending them. He would also comment on documents I had been working on in shared company drives, mentioning edits I had made or files I had accessed, making it clear that he was tracking my digital activity throughout the workday. The harassment extended beyond normal business hours, when Kenneth started contacting me through my personal phone and email accounts. I had never given him my personal contact information, but he had obviously obtained it through the company's employee database. He would send me text messages on weekends asking about work projects, or email me late at night with urgent IT-related questions that could have easily waited until business hours. These messages often included personal comments about my appearance, my work performance, or suggestions about how we could work more closely together. Kenneth's behavior became more aggressive when he started spreading false information about me to damage my professional reputation. He would tell colleagues in other departments that I had complained about their work, that I was difficult to work with, or that I had made critical comments about company policies. Several coworkers mentioned to me that Kenneth had approached them with concerns about my performance, claiming he was worried about my ability to handle my responsibilities. This created tension in workplace relationships and made me question which colleagues I could trust. The most disturbing escalation occurred when Kenneth began sabotaging my work projects and client relationships. He would intentionally cause technical problems during important presentations, claiming that the equipment malfunctions were beyond his control. He would accidentally delete files from shared company drives, forcing me to recreate work I had already completed. He started contacting my clients directly, claiming he was calling on behalf of the company to verify project details or discuss technical requirements, often sharing information that made me look unprofessional or incompetent. Kenneth's stalking behavior reached a terrifying climax when he cornered me in an empty conference room after hours. I was working late to prepare for an important client presentation the next morning when he appeared, claiming he needed to check the room's audiovisual equipment. Once we were alone, he closed the door and began expressing his feelings for me, saying he had been watching me for months and believed we had a special connection. When I firmly rejected his advances and tried to leave, he blocked my path and became increasingly agitated, insisting that I didn't understand how much he cared about me and how perfect we would be together. I managed to get out of the conference room and immediately reported the incident to my supervisor and HR. But the company's response was disappointingly inadequate. They conducted a brief investigation that essentially consisted of asking Kenneth if the incident had occurred, which he denied. Since there were no witnesses and no security cameras in that particular conference room, HR concluded they couldn't take disciplinary action based on my word alone. They suggested that I try to avoid working alone in the office and recommended that both Kenneth and I attend a workplace harassment training session. The harassment continued even after my formal complaint to HR. Kenneth became more careful about his behavior, making sure there were no witnesses when he approached me or made uncomfortable comments. He would wait until I was alone in elevators or stairwells to make suggestive remarks or ask personal questions. He started leaving notes on my desk when I was away from my workstation, sometimes containing work-related information mixed with personal comments about my appearance or suggestions that we spend time together outside of work. Kenneth's behavior escalated to stalking me outside of work when he began showing up at places I frequented after hours. He would appear at the gym where I exercised after work, the grocery store where I shopped on weekends, and coffee shops where I met friends. He would approach me in these locations, acting surprised to see me while making it clear that he knew my personal schedule and routines. He would comment on my workout clothes, mention what I had purchased at the store, or reference conversations he had overheard me having with friends. The final straw came when Kenneth gained access to my apartment building. I returned home one evening to find him waiting in the lobby, claiming he was visiting a friend who lived in the building but couldn't remember their apartment number. Security footage later revealed that he had been following me home for weeks, learning my address and daily schedule. He had been lurking around the building at different times, apparently studying the best ways to gain access and approach me when I was most vulnerable. I finally contacted the police after finding evidence that Kenneth had been in my apartment. Several personal items had been moved or were missing entirely, and I found notes hidden in places throughout my home that contained detailed observations about my living habits, sleep schedule, and personal routines. The notes referenced things like what I typically ate for breakfast, what television shows I watched, and what time I usually went to bed. Most disturbing were photographs that showed he had been inside my apartment multiple times, taking pictures of my bedroom, personal belongings, and private spaces. The police investigation revealed that Kenneth had used his IT skills and access to company systems to gather extensive personal information about me and potentially other female employees. They found evidence on his work computer of him accessing personnel files, tracking company email communications, and researching personal information about several women in the company. He had created detailed files documenting daily routines, personal relationships, and private information about multiple victims. Kenneth was arrested and charged with stalking, breaking and entering, invasion of privacy, and misuse of computer systems. The investigation also revealed that he had installed tracking software on company devices to monitor employee activities and had been using his position to spy on female coworkers for years. Several other women came forward with similar experiences once the investigation became public, showing that I was not his only victim. Even after Kenneth's arrest and termination from the company, the impact on my professional life was significant. I requested a transfer to a different office location and eventually changed jobs entirely to escape the association with the incident. The experience taught me that workplace stalking can be especially dangerous because the perpetrator has legitimate access to your daily schedule, personal information, and professional relationships. It showed me the importance of trusting instincts when someone's behavior feels inappropriate, even in a professional environment where we're expected to be collegial and cooperative. The psychological effects lasted long after Kenneth was imprisoned. I became hypervigilant about my personal security, constantly checking for signs that someone might be following me or monitoring my activities. I changed my daily routines, moved to a different apartment, and became much more cautious about sharing personal information with coworkers. The experience fundamentally changed how I interact in professional environments, making me realize that predators can exploit workplace accessibility and professional courtesy to target their victims in ways that are difficult to detect or prove. My name is Jordan, and I'm 24 years old. I'm currently a graduate student at Arizona State University in Phoenix, working on my master's degree in environmental science. What I'm about to share with you happened during my second year of graduate school and taught me that sometimes the most dangerous people are complete strangers who become fixated on you for reasons you'll never understand. It began at what should have been a safe place, my local gym, but quickly escalated into a nightmare that made me realize how vulnerable we all are to someone who decides to make us the object of their obsession. I had been going to the same fitness center for about 8 months when I first noticed him. He was probably in his early 30s, average height and build, with dark hair and an intense way of looking at people. At first, he seemed like any other gym member, someone focused on their workout routine, minding their own business. The gym was large and busy, with hundreds of members who came and went at different times, so I didn't think much about seeing the same faces regularly. It's normal to develop a routine and encounter the same people who work out at similar times. The first thing that caught my attention was how this man, who I later learned was named Vernon, started timing his workouts to coincide with mine. I typically went to the gym 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings after my classes ended around 6 o'clock. I began noticing that Vernon would arrive within minutes of me, no matter which day I came or if I occasionally switched my schedule. If I arrived early at 5:30, he would be there shortly after. If I came late at 7, he would show up around the same time. The coincidence seemed too frequent to be accidental. Vernon's behavior became more noticeable when he started positioning himself on exercise equipment that gave him direct lines of sight to wherever I was working out. If I was using the treadmills, he would choose a machine that faced the cardio area. When I moved to the weight section, he would select equipment nearby, always positioning himself where he could watch me while pretending to focus on his own exercises. I started feeling self-conscious about my workouts, constantly aware that someone was observing my every movement. The situation escalated when Vernon began following me home from the gym. I first noticed his car, a dark blue sedan, following behind me as I drove back to my apartment complex. Initially, I thought it might be coincidental since there are only a few main roads between the gym and my neighborhood. However, when I took an unusual route home one evening to avoid traffic, the same car followed every turn I made, maintaining a consistent distance behind me. When I pulled into my apartment complex, he drove past slowly, and I could see him looking toward my building. Vernon's stalking behavior extended beyond the gym when he started appearing at other locations I frequented around campus and in my neighborhood. I would see him at the coffee shop where I studied between classes, always sitting at a table where he could observe me while I worked on assignments. He would show up at the grocery store where I shopped on weekends, appearing in the same aisles and pretending to shop while clearly watching my activities. These encounters happened too frequently to be coincidences, and I began to realize that someone was deliberately tracking my daily routines. The harassment intensified when Vernon began leaving gifts for me at the gym. I would return from the restroom to find protein bars, energy drinks, or small notes left near my water bottle or gym bag. The notes started innocently enough. Hope you're having a good workout, or you're an inspiration to watch, but gradually became more personal and inappropriate. He started commenting on my appearance, my workout clothes, and my exercise routines in ways that made it clear he had been studying my habits in disturbing detail. Vernon somehow obtained my personal information and started contacting me through my university email account. His messages were initially posed as friendly fitness advice from a fellow gym member, but they quickly became more invasive and personal. He would reference specific details about my academic schedule, my research project, and my daily routines that he should not have known. He knew which classes I was taking, when I had meetings with my advisor, and where I typically studied on campus. The messages revealed that he had been researching my academic life and possibly following me around the university. The situation became truly frightening when Vernon started showing up at academic events and university functions where I was present. If I attended a guest lecture in my department, he would appear in the audience, always positioning himself where he could watch me throughout the event. When I participated in a research presentation for graduate students, he showed up claiming to be interested in environmental science, even though he clearly had no background or genuine interest in the subject matter. He would approach me after these events, trying to engage in conversations about my research while making personal comments that showed he had been monitoring my academic activities. Vernon's behavior escalated to stalking me at my part-time job, where I worked as a teaching assistant for undergraduate biology labs. He would show up during my office hours, claiming to be a prospective student interested in the environmental science program. He would ask detailed questions about my research, while making it clear that his real purpose was to spend time observing me in my professional environment. My supervising professor noticed his repeated appearances and became concerned about his behavior, especially when Vernon started asking personal questions about my schedule and availability. The most disturbing escalation occurred when Vernon began appearing outside my apartment building at various times of day and night. I would look out my window and see him sitting in his car in the parking lot, sometimes for hours at a time. He would position himself where he could see the entrance to my building, clearly monitoring when I came and went. Neighbors in my complex mentioned seeing a man asking questions about me, claiming to be a friend who was supposed to meet me but couldn't reach me by phone. Vernon started leaving more elaborate gifts and notes at my apartment door, which meant he had gained access to my building or was following other residents inside. The gifts became increasingly personal and expensive. Flowers, jewelry, books related to my field of study, and detailed handwritten letters expressing his feelings and obsession with me. The letters revealed that he had been fantasizing about a relationship between us and had created elaborate scenarios in which we would be together. He wrote about watching me study, observing my daily routines, and planning ways to insert himself into my life more directly. The harassment reached a terrifying climax when Vernon confronted me in the university parking garage after I finished teaching a late afternoon lab session. He approached me as I was walking to my car, blocking my path and demanding that I acknowledge the gifts he had been leaving and respond to his emails. When I firmly told him to leave me alone and attempted to walk around him, he became agitated and aggressive, insisting that we had a special connection and that I was being ungrateful for his attention and generosity. He grabbed my arm when I tried to get past him, and I had to scream for help before he released me and fled the scene. I immediately reported the incident to both university security and the local police, providing them with documentation of all the emails, notes, and gifts Vernon had been leaving, as well as photos I had taken of his car parked outside my apartment. The investigation revealed that Vernon was not actually a member of the gym where we had first encountered each other. He had been paying daily visitor fees specifically to gain access to the facility and stalked me during my workouts. The gym's security footage confirmed that he had been following me around the facility for months and had no legitimate fitness routine of his own. The police investigation also discovered that Vernon had been using various methods to gather personal information about me, including following me around campus, researching my academic work online, and possibly accessing university directories to obtain my contact information. They found evidence that he had been creating detailed files about my daily schedule, academic commitments, and personal routines. He had been taking photographs of me without my knowledge and had compiled extensive documentation of my activities over several months. Vernon was arrested and charged with stalking, harassment, and assault. During the legal proceedings, I learned that I was not his first victim. The investigation revealed that he had previously stalked at least 2 other women in different cities, using similar methods of following them from gyms and fitness centers, where he would observe their routines before escalating to more invasive stalking behaviors. He had a pattern of targeting young women who appeared to live alone and had predictable daily schedules that he could easily monitor and exploit. Even after Vernon's arrest and conviction, the psychological impact of being stalked by a complete stranger continued to affect my daily life for months. I had to change gyms, alter my daily routines, and move to a different apartment complex with better security features. I became hypervigilant about my surroundings, constantly checking for signs that someone might be following me or watching my activities. The experience taught me that random stalking by strangers can happen to anyone, anywhere, and that predators often target people in places where we feel safe and comfortable. The legal process was lengthy and emotionally exhausting, requiring me to relive the trauma repeatedly while testifying about Vernon's escalating stalking behavior. Even after he was sentenced to prison time and issued a restraining order, I lived with the fear that he might resume his stalking behavior once released. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach personal security and made me realize that we are all vulnerable to becoming the target of someone's dangerous obsession, regardless of whether we have any connection to or interaction with that person. The incident also affected my academic performance and social relationships, as the constant stress and anxiety of being stalked made it difficult to concentrate on my studies and maintain normal relationships with friends and colleagues. I had to seek counseling to deal with the trauma and develop coping strategies for the ongoing anxiety and paranoia that resulted from months of being systematically stalked and harassed by someone whose motivations I still don't understand and whose behaviors seem to escalate without any rational triggers or boundaries. My name is Taylor, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a registered nurse at a busy hospital in Miami, Florida. What I'm about to share with you happened during what should have been one of the most routine parts of modern life, using a rideshare app to get around the city. It started with a single Uber ride that I thought nothing of at the time. But it quickly escalated into a months-long nightmare that made me realize how much personal information we unknowingly share with strangers, and how that information can be weaponized by someone with malicious intentions. It was a Thursday evening in late October when I first encountered Garrett as my Uber driver. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital and was exhausted from dealing with a particularly challenging day in the emergency department. I requested a ride home through the app, and within minutes, Garrett arrived in a clean, well-maintained sedan. He seemed professional and courteous, greeting me politely and confirming my destination before we began the 20-minute drive to my apartment complex. The ride was unremarkable. We made small talk about traffic and the weather, and he delivered me safely to my building. Over the next 2 weeks, something strange began happening. Despite the fact that Miami has thousands of Uber drivers, and I typically use the service only a few times per week, Garrett kept appearing as my assigned driver. At first, I attributed this to coincidence, or perhaps the app's algorithm matching passengers with drivers who had previously provided good service. He continued to be polite and professional, always arriving promptly and taking efficient routes to my destinations. I even started to appreciate the consistency, since he knew where I lived and worked, which made the ride smoother. However, I began to feel uncomfortable when I realized that Garrett seemed to know my schedule better than he should have. He would comment on my work shifts, mentioning that I looked tired after what he assumed were long days at the hospital, even when I hadn't told him I was coming from work. He would ask about my weekend plans in ways that suggested he already knew some details about my routine. When I mentioned that I was planning to visit my parents, he would ask follow-up questions that indicated he knew where they lived, even though I had never used the app to go to their house. The situation became more disturbing when I started seeing Garrett's car in places where I hadn't requested rides. I would notice his distinctive sedan parked near my apartment building when I returned from errands I had completed on foot or with friends. When I went grocery shopping at my usual store, I would sometimes see him in the parking lot, even though I had driven my own car there. He would wave if he saw me, acting as though these encounters were coincidental. But the frequency made it clear that he was deliberately positioning himself in locations where he knew I would. Garrett began showing up as my driver, even when I specifically tried to avoid him. I started canceling rides when I saw his name and photo appear as my assigned driver. But he would often show up anyway, claiming that the app had glitched and he had received the pickup request despite the cancellation. He would insist that since he was already there, it would be easier for me to just accept the ride, rather than wait for another driver. Initially, I went along with this to avoid confrontation. But I began to realize that he was manipulating the system somehow to ensure he would be assigned to my requests. The harassment escalated when Garrett started contacting me through multiple phone numbers and social media platforms. He had obviously obtained my personal information through his access to my Uber profile, which contained my phone number and likely other details I had provided to the service. He would send text messages late at night, claiming he was just checking to make sure I had gotten home safely after rides, or asking if I needed transportation for upcoming events he somehow knew about. He created fake social media accounts to send me friend requests and messages, always acting as though he was just being friendly and helpful. Garrett's behavior became increasingly invasive when he started showing up at my workplace. The hospital where I work has strict security protocols, but he would wait in the parking garage or near the main entrance, claiming he was there to pick up other passengers while obviously watching for me to arrive or leave. He would approach me during my breaks, offering free rides or bringing me coffee, insisting that he enjoyed our conversations and wanted to do something nice for a hard-working healthcare professional. These encounters made me extremely uncomfortable, especially since my colleagues began noticing and asking questions about why the same Uber driver kept appearing at our workplace. The most terrifying escalation occurred when Garrett began demonstrating detailed knowledge about my personal life and daily routines. He knew what time I typically woke up, what I usually ate for breakfast, and which route I took when I walked my dog in the mornings. He would reference conversations I had had with friends during rides, proving that he had been recording or somehow monitoring my phone calls and private discussions. He knew about medical appointments I had scheduled, family events I was planning to attend, and even personal problems I was dealing with that I had never discussed with him directly. Garrett started leaving gifts and notes at my apartment door, which meant he had gained access to my building or was somehow getting inside the secure lobby. The gifts were always related to things he had learned about me through our rides or his surveillance. My favorite coffee shop, books related to my hobbies, or items that referenced private conversations he had overheard. The notes became increasingly personal and inappropriate, expressing his feelings for me and describing how much he enjoyed being part of my daily routine through his role as my driver. The situation reached a breaking point when Garrett confronted me at my apartment complex parking garage late one evening after I had specifically avoided using Uber for several days. He was waiting by my car when I returned from a friend's house, demanding to know why I had been avoiding his services and insisting that he was only trying to be helpful and friendly. When I told him his behavior was inappropriate and asked him to leave me alone, he became agitated and aggressive, blocking my path to the building and insisting that we had developed a special relationship through our rides that I was unfairly trying to end. I immediately reported Garrett to Uber and provided them with documentation of his stalking behavior, including screenshots of his inappropriate messages and photos of the gifts he had left at my apartment. However, the company's response was disappointing and inadequate. They claimed they would investigate the matter and potentially remove him from their platform. But they were limited in what actions they could take, since much of his stalking behavior occurred outside of official ride requests. They suggested I block his phone number and report him to local police if I felt threatened, but offered little else in terms of protection or prevention. The police investigation revealed that Garrett had been systematically stalking multiple female passengers using information he obtained through his role as an Uber driver. He had been using the app's GPS tracking features to monitor passengers' locations and learn their daily routines, then using that information to follow them and insert himself into their lives outside of legitimate ride requests. He had created elaborate files documenting the personal lives of dozens of women, using details he gathered from overhearing their phone conversations, observing their behavior during rides, and researching them online using information from their Uber profiles. Garrett was arrested and charged with stalking, harassment, and violations of privacy laws related to his misuse of the rideshare platform. The investigation also revealed that he had been taking photos and videos of passengers without their knowledge and had been sharing personal information about female riders with other individuals online. Several other women came forward with similar experiences once his arrest became public, showing that his predatory behavior had been ongoing for years across multiple rideshare platforms. Even after Garrett's arrest and the criminal charges against him, the experience fundamentally changed how I think about rideshare services and the personal information we share with strangers. I stopped using Uber and similar services entirely, choosing instead to drive my own car or use traditional taxis when necessary. I had to change my phone number, move to a different apartment complex, and modify my daily routines to ensure that other potential predators couldn't easily track my movements or predict my schedule. The psychological impact of being stalked by someone who had legitimate access to my personal information and daily routines was severe and long-lasting. I developed anxiety about using any service that required sharing my location or personal details with strangers, and I became hypervigilant about checking for signs that someone might be following me or monitoring my activities. The experience taught me that rideshare services, while convenient, create unique vulnerabilities that can be exploited by individuals with predatory intentions, and that the companies operating these platforms often have inadequate safeguards to protect passengers from drivers who abuse their access to personal information and location data. My name is Sam, and I'm 22 years old. I'm currently a senior at the University of Washington in Seattle, studying communications and working part-time at a local bookstore. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 5 months and taught me that the services we rely on for basic transportation can become weapons in the hands of someone with malicious intentions. It started with what should have been simple, safe rideshare trips around campus and the city. But it quickly escalated into a nightmare that made me realize how vulnerable we are when we trust strangers with our personal information and daily routines. I had been using Uber regularly for about 6 months before I first encountered Liam as my driver. As a college student without a car, rideshare apps were essential for getting to my part-time job, social events, and appointments around Seattle. Liam seemed like a typical driver when I first met him. Probably in his mid-30s, friendly but professional, driving a clean Toyota Camry with good ratings on the app. He was polite during our initial rides, asking about my studies and making casual conversation about the weather and local events. Nothing about his behavior seemed unusual or concerning at first. What began to disturb me was how frequently Liam appeared as my assigned driver. Despite the fact that Seattle has thousands of active Uber drivers, and I typically requested rides from different locations around the city at various times of day. Within a few weeks, he was picking me up for nearly every ride I requested, whether I was going from my dorm to work, from campus to friends' apartments, or from downtown back to the university. When I mentioned this strange coincidence to friends, they suggested it might be the app's algorithm matching me with drivers who had provided good service. But the frequency seemed beyond normal. Liam started demonstrating knowledge about my schedule and personal life that he shouldn't have possessed. He would arrive for pickups before I had even requested a ride, claiming he had been in the area and saw that I usually needed transportation around that time. He would comment on my work schedule at the bookstore, mentioning that I looked tired after what he assumed were long shifts, even when I hadn't told him I was coming from work. He knew details about my class schedule and would ask about assignments or exams that I had mentioned to friends during previous rides, showing that he had been listening closely to my private conversations. The situation became more uncomfortable when Liam started showing up at locations where I hadn't requested rides. I would see his car parked near the bookstore where I worked, even on days when I had walked to work or taken the bus. He would wave if he saw me, claiming he was waiting for other pickup requests in the area. But the timing was too coincidental. I started noticing his vehicle parked near my dormitory at odd hours, and when I went to study at coffee shops or the library, he would sometimes appear in those locations as well, always with an excuse about being nearby for other rides. Liam began contacting me through phone calls and text messages outside of the Uber app, which meant he had access to my personal phone number through my rider profile. He would send texts late at night or early in the morning, claiming he wanted to make sure I'd gotten home safely after rides, or asking if I needed transportation for events he somehow knew about. The messages became increasingly personal, with him commenting on my appearance, my choice of clothing, or my mood during recent rides. He started offering me discounted or free rides, insisting that he enjoyed our conversations and wanted to help a hardworking student save money. The harassment escalated when Liam started appearing at social events and locations around campus where I spent time with friends. If I went to parties, study groups, or campus events, he would often show up claiming to be picking up other students. But he would approach me specifically to chat and ask about my plans for the evening. He knew details about my social life that he could only have obtained by monitoring my activities or eavesdropping on conversations during rides. He would reference things like which friends I had been spending time with, what restaurants I liked, or plans I had made for upcoming weekends. Liam's behavior became increasingly invasive when he started offering to drive me to locations that weren't available through the regular Uber app. He would suggest picking me up for personal errands, social events, or trips that were outside the normal rideshare service area. He insisted that he wanted to help me as a friend rather than just a driver, and he would offer these services for free or at reduced rates. When I declined these offers and tried to maintain professional boundaries, he would become persistent and sometimes pushy, insisting that he was just trying to be helpful and that most students would appreciate the extra assistance. The situation reached a disturbing level when Liam began showing up at my dormitory building at times when I hadn't requested any rides. Residents in my building started mentioning that a man had been asking questions about me, claiming to be a driver who needed to deliver something or confirm pickup details. He would wait in the parking area or lobby, telling building security that he was there to pick me up for a scheduled ride, even when I had no transportation plans. These incidents made me realize that he was actively seeking ways to access my living space and monitor my daily activities. Lim started leaving gifts and notes in his car for me to find during rides, which made me extremely uncomfortable and showed that he was planning these encounters rather than treating them as professional transportation services. The gifts were always small items related to things he had learned about my interests during our conversations. Books related to my major, coffee shop gift cards, or items related to hobbies I had mentioned. The notes became increasingly personal and inappropriate, expressing his feelings for me and describing how much he enjoyed being part of my daily routine through his role as my driver. The most frightening escalation occurred when Lim confronted me at my workplace during my shift at the bookstore. He entered the store claiming to be browsing for books, but he approached me directly and demanded to know why I had been avoiding using Uber services and specifically declining rides when I saw his name as my assigned driver. When I explained that his behavior was making me uncomfortable and asked him to leave me alone, he became agitated and insisted that we had developed a special friendship that I was unfairly trying to end. He blocked my path when I tried to return to work and continued arguing until my supervisor intervened and asked him to leave the store. I immediately reported Lim to Uber and provided them with documentation of his inappropriate behavior, including screenshots of his text messages and a detailed account of his stalking activities. However, the company's response was disappointing and inadequate. They claimed they would investigate the situation and potentially remove him from their platform. But they explained that their ability to take action was limited since much of his stalking behavior occurred outside of official ride requests. They suggested I block his phone number and avoid using their service temporarily, but offered little in terms of actual protection or prevention of further harassment. The police investigation revealed that Lim had been systematically stalking multiple female passengers using information he obtained through his access to rider profiles and GPS tracking features. He had been using the app's system to monitor passengers' pickup and drop-off locations, learning their daily routines and personal schedules, then using that information to follow them and insert himself into their lives outside of legitimate transportation requests. He had created detailed files documenting the personal lives and daily activities of dozens of young women, most of them college students who used rideshare services regularly. Lim was arrested and charged with stalking, harassment, and misuse of the rideshare platform systems. The investigation also revealed that he had been taking photos and videos of passengers without their knowledge, recording private conversations during rides, and sharing personal information about female riders with other individuals online. Several other women came forward with similar experiences once his arrest became public, showing that his predatory behavior had been ongoing for over a year and had affected numerous victims across the Seattle area. Even after Lim's arrest and the criminal charges filed against him, the impact on my daily life was significant and long-lasting. I stopped using Uber and similar rideshare services entirely, choosing instead to use public transportation, walk, or ask friends for rides when necessary. I had to change my phone number to stop receiving messages from phone numbers he had shared with other people, and I modified my daily routines to make it harder for anyone else who might have obtained my personal information to track my movements or predict my schedule. The psychological effects of being stalked by someone who had legitimate access to my location data and personal information were severe. I developed anxiety about using any technology-based services that required sharing my location or personal details with strangers. And I became hypervigilant about checking for signs that someone might be following me or monitoring my activities. The experience taught me that rideshare services, while convenient and generally safe, create unique vulnerabilities that can be exploited by individuals with predatory intentions who abuse their positions of trust and access to personal information. The legal process was emotionally exhausting and required me to repeatedly describe the escalating harassment while testifying about Lim's behavior. Even after he was convicted and sentenced to jail time with restrictions on his future use of rideshare platforms, I continued to worry about encountering him again once he was released from prison. The experience fundamentally changed how I think about personal safety and the information we share with service providers, making me realize that the convenience of modern technology often comes with hidden risks that we don't fully consider until we become victims of someone who chooses to exploit those vulnerabilities for their own harmful purposes. My name is Alex, and I'm 27 years old. I work as an adjunct professor teaching sociology at Boston University. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 6 months and taught me that the academic world, which should be a place of learning and intellectual growth, can become a nightmare when someone refuses to respect professional boundaries. It started with what seemed like an enthusiastic student who was genuinely interested in my courses. But it quickly escalated into a terrifying situation that threatened my career, my safety, and my sanity. Pierce was a graduate student in his mid-20s who enrolled in my advanced sociology seminar during the fall semester. Initially, he appeared to be an ideal student, engaged, articulate, and passionate about the subject matter. He would stay after class to ask thoughtful questions, participated actively in discussions, and submitted well-researched papers that demonstrated a deep understanding of sociological concepts. His academic performance was exemplary, and I appreciated having such a dedicated student in a class that sometimes struggled to generate meaningful participation from other enrolled students. The first sign that something was amiss came when Pierce started seeking excessive amounts of individual attention outside of normal office hours. While it's common for graduate students to request meetings with professors to discuss research interests or career guidance, Pierce's requests became increasingly frequent and often involved topics that were only tangentially related to our coursework. He would email me multiple times per week, asking for meetings, often sending these requests late at night or early in the morning, and becoming persistent when I couldn't accommodate his schedule immediately. Pierce began demonstrating an unusual level of interest in my personal life and professional background. During our meetings, he would ask detailed questions about my educational history, my research projects, and my career trajectory that went far beyond normal student curiosity about a professor's qualifications. He started researching my academic publications extensively, not just reading the papers I'd assigned for class, but seeking out every article and conference presentation I had ever produced. He would reference obscure papers I had written years earlier in casual conversation, making it clear that he was studying my work obsessively. The situation became more uncomfortable when Pierce started attending academic events and conferences where I was presenting, even when these events were outside his field of interest or geographical area. If I was giving a guest lecture at another university, presenting at a professional conference, or participating in academic panels, Pierce would somehow appear in the audience. He would approach me after these presentations to ask detailed questions and compliment my work, acting as though these encounters were coincidental even though the pattern was clearly intentional. Pierce's behavior escalated when he began appearing at locations around campus where I spent time outside of teaching responsibilities. If I was having lunch in the faculty dining area, he would show up with his meal and ask to join me, claiming he happened to be eating at the same time. When I worked late in my office, he would find excuses to visit the building, stopping by to ask questions that could have easily been addressed via email. He started monitoring my schedule so closely that he knew exactly when I would be in specific buildings or attending particular meetings. The harassment intensified when Pierce began researching my personal life outside of my professional activities. He started making casual references to my living situation, my daily routines, and my social activities that he could not have learned through normal student-teacher interactions. He knew details about where I lived, what coffee shops I frequented, and which grocery stores I used for shopping. When I mentioned being tired after a weekend trip, he would ask specific questions about where I had traveled, demonstrating knowledge of my personal schedule that was completely inappropriate for a student to possess. Pierce started using academic discussions as a vehicle for increasingly personal and inappropriate comments. During class discussions about gender dynamics, power structures, or social relationships, he would make comments that seemed directed specifically at me, rather than engaging with the theoretical concepts we were studying. He would reference my appearance, my teaching style, or my personal characteristics in ways that made other students uncomfortable and disrupted the learning environment for everyone in the seminar. The situation became truly disturbing when Pierce began submitting written assignments that were clearly about me rather than the assigned topics. His papers would include detailed descriptions of a fictional female professor who bore an obvious resemblance to me, complete with references to my physical appearance, my teaching methods, and scenarios that depicted romantic or sexual relationships between students and faculty members. When I confronted him about the inappropriate content of these assignments, he claimed they were academic explorations of power dynamics and insisted that any resemblance to real people was purely coincidental. Pierce started contacting me through multiple communication channels outside of normal academic interactions. In addition to excessive emails related to coursework, he began sending messages through social media platforms, leaving voicemails on my office phone after hours, and even sending letters to my home address. These communications became increasingly personal and inappropriate, expressing admiration for me that went far beyond normal student appreciation for a professor's teaching abilities. He began describing feelings of connection and intimacy that were completely one-sided and unwelcome. The most frightening escalation occurred when Pierce began following me to locations off campus and monitoring my personal activities. I started noticing him at restaurants where I was dining with friends, at cultural events I attended on weekends, and even at social gatherings hosted by other faculty members. He would position himself where he could observe my interactions with other people, and he would sometimes approach me at these events to make conversation, acting as though his presence was normal and expected rather than invasive and inappropriate. Pierce's behavior reached a crisis point when he confronted me in an empty classroom building after evening hours, blocking my path and demanding that I acknowledge the special relationship he believed existed between us. He insisted that our academic interactions had created a unique bond and that I was being unfair by maintaining professional boundaries. When I firmly told him that his behavior was inappropriate and that he needed to respect normal student-teacher relationships, he became agitated and accused me of leading him on through my teaching methods and our academic discussions. I immediately reported Pierce to the university administration and provided them with documentation of his escalating inappropriate behavior, including copies of his disturbing written assignments, screenshots of his excessive communications, and a detailed account of his stalking activities both on and off campus. The university's response was initially cautious, as they needed to balance my safety concerns against Pierce's rights as a student. But they agreed to investigate the situation and implement interim measures to limit his access to me. The investigation revealed that Pierce had been systematically researching my personal life using university resources and had been monitoring my activities far more extensively than I had realized. He had been accessing my personnel files through the university's computer systems, tracking my teaching schedule across multiple semesters, and had even been following me to conferences and professional events in other cities. The university found evidence that he had been taking photographs of me without my knowledge, and had created detailed files documenting my daily routines and personal relationships. Pierce was suspended from the university and eventually expelled for violating multiple policies related to student conduct, harassment, and misuse of university resources. The investigation also revealed that he had engaged in similar behavior toward at least one other female faculty member in the past, suggesting a pattern of predatory conduct rather than an isolated incident of inappropriate student behavior. Criminal charges were filed when evidence emerged that he had been trespassing on university property to gain access to buildings where I worked and had been following me to my residential neighborhood. Even after Pierce's expulsion and the criminal charges filed against him, the impact on my professional life was significant. I had to request changes to my teaching schedule and office location to ensure my safety, and I became much more cautious about interacting with students, particularly male graduate students who showed excessive interest in my work or personal life. The experience made me realize how vulnerable faculty members can be to students who abuse the trust and access that are inherent in academic relationships. The psychological effects of being stalked by a student were severe and long-lasting. I developed anxiety about teaching, constantly worried about whether other students might develop similar obsessions, and found it difficult to maintain the open and engaging teaching style that had previously been my strength as an educator. The experience taught me that academic environments, despite their intellectual focus and professional standards, can become dangerous spaces when individuals choose to exploit the power dynamics and personal access that characterize student-teacher relationships. The legal proceedings were lengthy and emotionally exhausting, requiring me to repeatedly describe Pierce's escalating harassment while testifying about the impact his behavior had on my ability to perform my professional duties effectively. Even after he was convicted and sentenced to probation with a restraining order, I continued to worry about encountering him again, either on campus or in academic settings where our professional paths might cross in the future. The experience fundamentally changed my approach to student interactions and made me much more vigilant about maintaining strict professional boundaries in all my academic relationships. My name is Casey, and I'm 33 years old. I work as a freelance writer from my home in rural Oregon, about 40 minutes outside of Portland. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 9 months and taught me that sometimes the most terrifying predators are the ones who remain completely anonymous, watching from the shadows without ever revealing themselves. It started with subtle signs that someone was paying attention to my daily routines, but it escalated into a nightmare that made me question my safety in my own home and forced me to consider whether isolation in the countryside offers protection or makes us more vulnerable to those who wish us harm. The first indication that something was wrong came through my mail. I started receiving letters addressed to me with no return address, postmarked from the nearby town where I occasionally went for groceries and supplies. The letters contained detailed observations about my daily activities, written in neat handwriting that seemed deliberately disguised. The anonymous writer described things like what time I typically started working at my computer each morning, which window in my house had the best light for reading, and what I usually wore when I took walks around my property. These details were specific enough to make it clear that someone had been watching me closely, but vague enough that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when or how they were conducting this surveillance. The content of the letters became increasingly personal and disturbing as weeks passed. The anonymous writer would comment on my work habits, describing how I looked when I was concentrating on writing projects, mentioning the books I read during breaks, and even referencing phone conversations I had had with clients and family members. They knew details about my freelance work that should have been private, including which publications I wrote for and what types of articles I was researching. Most disturbingly, they would describe my emotional states, claiming to know when I was stressed about deadlines, frustrated with difficult projects, or happy about successful publications. I began noticing physical evidence that someone had been on my property without my knowledge or permission. Small items around my yard would be moved or rearranged in subtle ways that I might not have noticed if I weren't already feeling paranoid about the letters. My outdoor furniture would be positioned differently than I remembered leaving it. Garden tools would be relocated to different areas of my shed. And personal items like wind chimes or decorative objects would be turned or adjusted in ways that seemed intentional rather than accidental. These changes were never dramatic or obviously malicious, but the pattern was consistent enough to convince me that someone was regularly accessing my property when I was away or asleep. The stalking behavior escalated when the anonymous letters started including references to things that could only have been observed from inside my house. The writer would describe the layout of my home office, comment on what I had eaten for dinner on specific nights, and mention television shows I had watched or music I had listened to while working. They knew details about my sleep schedule, my morning routines, and my habits when I thought I was completely alone and unobserved. These revelations made me realize that someone had either been inside my house or had been watching through windows with a level of persistence and dedication that was absolutely terrifying. I started receiving anonymous phone calls that followed a disturbing pattern. The calls would come at different times of day and night, and when I answered, there would be several seconds of silence followed by heavy breathing or whispered comments that I could barely understand. Sometimes the caller would hang up immediately. Other times they would stay on the line for several minutes without speaking, just listening to me say hello repeatedly. On a few occasions, I could hear what sounded like someone moving around or handling objects, as though they were calling from inside a house or building rather than from a phone booth or public location. The harassment intensified when personal items started disappearing from my property. Initially, I thought I was simply misplacing things or forgetting where I had left them, but the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Small items with personal significance would vanish. A coffee mug I used every morning, a favorite pen I kept on my desk, a small decorative picture frame that usually sat on my nightstand. These items were never valuable enough to suggest typical theft, but they were all objects that I used frequently or that had emotional meaning, suggesting that the person taking them wanted to disturb my daily routines and psychological comfort rather than steal anything of monetary value. The most terrifying discovery came when I found a detailed journal hidden on my property that documented months of surveillance. While cleaning out an old storage shed behind my house, I discovered a notebook wedged behind some farming equipment that had been left by previous owners of the property. The journal contained hundreds of entries describing my daily activities, work schedule, personal habits, and emotional states, all written in the same handwriting as the anonymous letters I had been receiving. The entries went back much further than when I had first started receiving letters, showing that someone had been watching me for almost a year before they began making contact. The journal entries revealed the extent of the stalking behavior and showed that the anonymous watcher had been accessing my property regularly to conduct surveillance. They had detailed maps of my house and yard, notes about which windows provided the best views into different rooms, and observations about my security habits, such as when I locked doors, whether I closed curtains at night, and what times I was most likely to be away from home. The entries also contain disturbing fantasies about interacting with me, and detailed plans for gradually increasing contact and inserting themselves into my life more directly. The final escalation occurred when I started finding evidence that someone had been inside my house while I was away. Items would be moved slightly from where I remembered leaving them. Food would be missing from my refrigerator, and I would find muddy footprints on my floors that didn't match my shoes. Most disturbing was finding photographs hidden throughout my house. Pictures of me sleeping, working at my computer, cooking dinner, and going about my daily routines. All taken from inside my home without my knowledge. Some photos showed me in states of undress, and others were taken from positions that suggested the photographer had been hiding in my house for extended periods. I immediately contacted the police and turned over all the evidence I had collected, including the anonymous letters, the surveillance journal, and the photographs that had been hidden in my house. The investigation revealed that the stalker had been accessing my property through a basement window that faced the woods behind my house, using the cover of trees and darkness to approach without being seen from the road. They found evidence of a makeshift camp in the woods, where someone had been conducting long-term surveillance of my property, complete with camping equipment, binoculars, and additional photographs of me and my daily activities. The police investigation also uncovered that the stalker had been researching my personal and professional life extensively, using online resources to gather information about my freelance work, my family background, and my financial situation. They had been monitoring my social media accounts through fake profiles and had even contacted some of my professional clients under false pretenses to gather information about my work schedule and personal habits. The level of research and planning revealed a sophisticated and organized stalking operation that had been ongoing for over a year. Despite the extensive evidence and the police investigation, the anonymous stalker was never identified or captured. The surveillance equipment and personal items found at the campsite in the woods didn't provide enough forensic evidence to identify a specific individual, and the stalking behavior stopped abruptly once the police became involved, suggesting that the perpetrator realized they were being investigated and decided to disappear rather than risk capture. The case remains open, but the lack of clear leads and the remote location made it difficult for authorities to pursue the investigation effectively. The psychological impact of being stalked by a completely anonymous person was devastating and long-lasting. Unlike stalking situations where the victim knows the identity of their harasser, being watched by someone whose identity, motives, and next moves are completely unknown creates a unique type of terror and paranoia. I installed extensive security systems around my property, including cameras, motion sensors, and alarm systems. But the fear that someone might be watching from the woods or hiding nearby never completely disappeared. I ultimately decided to move away from the rural property and relocate to a more populated area, where neighbors are closer and strangers would be more easily noticed and questioned. The experience taught me that isolation, while offering privacy and peace, also creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by predators who use the distance from help and witnesses as advantages in their stalking behavior. Even now, several years later, I remain hyper-vigilant about my personal security and continue to worry that the anonymous stalker might someday decide to resume their harassment in my new location. That concludes our journey through 10 of the most disturbing, true stalker horror stories I've encountered. Each of these accounts reminds us that the threat of stalking can come from anywhere. From people we trust, strangers we encounter briefly, or even anonymous watchers who remain hidden in the shadows. The victims in these stories showed incredible courage in sharing their experiences. and their accounts serve as important warnings about the various forms that stalking behavior can take in our modern world. If you or someone you know is dealing with stalking or harassment, please don't hesitate to reach out for help. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that no one deserves to live in fear. Thank you for joining me for another episode of MrNightveil. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe for more true horror content. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who walk among us every day. Until next time, stay safe out there and keep watching the shadows.